Is it time to boost your company's revenue by going after commercial customers or getting your B2B business development plan back on track? Whether you're just getting started or going through a complete overhaul or revamp, here are some things to consider. In part 5 of this 5-part series, we're going to talk about activity tracking.
Running a service business can be hard. It is not unusual for business owners in industries like contracting, home repair, auto repair, business-to-business services like janitorial, IT and accounting, and many others to feel overwhelmed by all the priorities facing them at any given time. Between addressing the needs of the customers, managing the employees, figuring out the financials, and getting processes in place, feeling like you're making significant progress on your business journey can be difficult. Welcome to Service Industry Success, hosted by Brian Harding. Each week, Brian will look at real-world strategies for building the business you are dreaming of, while also sharing tactics to get through some of the most frustrating parts of business ownership with a lot more ease. Let's get started.
With any sales effort, like anything else we do, we need to have proper tracking. In this series, this 5-part series on B2B and commercial business development, we've talked so far about planning and messaging. And of course, there's a lot more to getting business from outreach efforts than just planning, messaging, and reporting. But most of the other sales activities aren't areas where we're likely to face major challenges. There's some nuances here and there, but overall, these are like the 3 areas I think that we or at least I struggle with the most, and I've seen other people struggle with the most. The point of this series has been to focus on the key areas that I myself and others have struggled with. So to wrap up the series, we're going to talk a little bit about goals, but mostly about activity tracking. This is an area that perhaps best highlights, for me, how our opinion changes dramatically on a topic depending on whether we're the employee or the manager. As an employee, I absolutely hated all the tracking, but I wasn't even eligible for my monthly bonus if I couldn't document at least 10 appointments per week. Now, an appointment in my case meant they had the prospective customer had to know I was coming. A drop-in or a cold call did not qualify as an appointment, and if I didn't have enough appointments, then I would not be able to get my bonus. So I tracked my activities, begrudgingly, but I did it. But as a manager and business owner, it was absolutely critical to know how our sales efforts were going, what kind of activity we were focusing most heavily on or actually performing the most often, how well our salespeople were planning future activities like follow-ups, and of course, how the results are coming along. So I think having a tracking and reporting plan we stick to religiously is absolutely necessary. And I've long said that managing people in outside sales role is perhaps the most difficult of all positions to manage. On the one hand, a position like this with this kind of latitude is ripe for abuse. The freedom is almost intoxicating. We had a sales guy when I was an employee for a sales manager for a corporation. We had a sales guy named Mike, and he was like a 62-year-old guy, devoutly religious guy. He was just a solid man. Like, he was a good man. And one time I caught him completely fabricating his call reports. Like, his GPS didn't match up with like where he said he was going. And I called him in my office, and I'm like, Mike, what's going on here? And he just started crying. Like, he got emotional because he had been caught, but he was embarrassed. And my point is, it's not, I don't think it's so much about the person as this kind of role just is ripe for abuse. I talked before about a guy we had, different sales guy, who we found out later on was like working another job, and we didn't know. We thought he was our sales guy, but he was actually out doing other jobs while he was supposed to be our sales guy. So my point is, this position we just have to be careful because there is so much freedom and that freedom just becomes intoxicating. On the other hand, trying to Monday morning quarterback and remotely direct every move a salesperson makes is not only ineffective because you can't feel how sales calls are going remotely and therefore decide which direction to take the conversation, but also trying to remotely manage salespeople kills their spirit. And that spirit is a huge part of what makes them effective. I mean, these people literally go out every day and are told no, or are disregarded, or treated like a nuisance, or just treated poorly. Like my friend Mike, who's a sales manager, he talked about how they just go out and get kicked in the teeth every day. That's a lot of it. So you have to have a spirit, a positive energy to go out and be able to do that. So the question for us all to answer is, what's the right balance? How much is an appropriate amount of tracking and reporting, but what it would be too much where we're just like restricting them and like killing their spirit? So the question for us is, what's the right balance? More on that in a second. First, if you want help getting your B2B or business development program going, or want to make it more productive, I'd invite you to come check out my group called Business Tips, which stands for Business Tactics and Immediate Problem Solving. For less than $100 a month and only 2 Zoom meetings a month that you have to attend, or you can attend, I should say, you'll have a place to get immediate answers to questions you have and shorten the learning curve from the experience of other business owners. And you can share your experience and you can help other people. It's an ideal place to work through the challenges you're facing with properly allocating your salesperson's time or your own if you're the one out there beating the bush, creating and improving your compelling message, learning your buyer's decision-making process and criteria, tracking and reviewing sales activities, managing your development, your business development team, and other related challenges you have. Plus, you'll learn tips and tricks I picked up over the years from personally generating over $40 million in revenue from business development and managing teams of people who've been responsible for another $40 million. To join, just go to joinbusinesstips.com. That's joinbusinesstips.com. All right, so one of the key questions I would suggest we start with when creating a recording plan is, how many hours a week do I want my salesperson to spend tracking their efforts? Spending probably spending over 5 hours a week on tracking activity is maybe taking too much of our precious time and spending it on non-sales activities. If we're having a salesperson who's spending an hour and a half, 2 hours a day tracking, that means that's an hour and a half, 2 hours a day they're not selling. So that's probably too much. On the other hand, if we're only spending 1 hour a week, that's probably not enough. So somewhere in there, I would start with, if I was to do this now, I would start with like, what is the amount of time I want my salesperson spending tracking time versus out actually selling? Another way to look at this is to ask, what is the minimum amount of information I would need to be able to pick up where the salesperson left off if they won the lottery and moved to the Caribbean? One of the biggest mistakes I ever made was having a salesperson leave and not having enough useful information to help me know where they were with their prospects and kind of pick up where they left off after they were gone. I had to start all over and reinvest the same money again just to get right back where they were. And that was not only frustrating, but it was an expensive lesson. So at any rate, starting with an idea how much the salesperson's time should be split between sales and tracking activities has been helpful for me, even if I'm the one who's the salesperson. So if I'm the business owner and the salesperson, I still want to know how much of my time should be devoted to sales activities, and of that time, how much time should I be spending tracking? Because my memory is not good enough to remember, all the things I did after a few weeks or months and dozens or even hundreds of conversations later. I won't remember necessarily where I went, a recap of who I spoke to, what we talked about, what their name was, next steps, like all that. I will forget that stuff. So even if I'm doing the one doing it, I still need to carve out enough time to do that well, so that when I reflect on my notes weeks or months later, I kind of know where we were at, right? And I'm going to have, like anything, I'm going to be far more effective if I have stated goals. So I'm going to spend this much time doing sales stuff. I'm going to spend this much time tracking. Here's the specific things I need to be tracking. And again, who I talked to, the gist of the conversation, next steps, what their pain points were, stuff that I can jot down in 2 minutes or less, right? But very specific things, so I'm being consistent. When we're talking goals, I think it's also helpful to have clarity about different types of sales activities. Like, what's the difference between an appointment and a drop-in? Going back to my example earlier, I didn't qualify for my bonus if I had 10 drop-ins. I had to have 10 appointments. Well, what's an appointment, right? So if we don't have clarity about simple distinctions like that, things get pretty murky pretty quick. And again, we want to have goals, but we can't be so rigid as to deter productive sales efforts to stay in alignment with these restricting expectations. Some of the greatest sales calls are absolutely spontaneous. One time I was riding with a guy and we drove past a Charlie's Produce, which is a huge company. And on a whim, we're just driving by and he said, I didn't even think about these guys. These guys would be great for us. Let's pull in. And so on a whim, he went in, see if he could find out the person to contact about becoming their supplier. And Charlie's Produce turned out to be a major get for us. So I don't want to have such restrictive planning that our salespeople can't make productive, spontaneous decisions like that. But on the other hand, it can't be a free for all either, because if we're too lax with expectations, soon we'll have a part-time salesperson who's making full-time wages. So neither of those extremes is okay. So once we have clarity with the terms, like differentiating an appointment from a drop-in or a cold call, we can actually start seeing from simple reporting what is happening. If we only distinguish between in-person visits, let's say, this all-encompassing term for meeting somebody or being on site at a property, a visit is a word I've seen used on sales reports before. Well, a visit could be an appointment. It could be a cold call where you talk to somebody, like like where you walk in the door and you actually talk to somebody. It could be where you went in and dropped your card off because you couldn't get a hold of the decision maker. All those could be visits, and they have dramatically different impacts on the sales. The one is way more beneficial than the others for sure, right? So if we only distinguish between visits and phone calls and emails, it's much more difficult to understand what's actually happening and to be sure our salespeople are diligent about the follow up, which is not always a strength with salespeople, and is quite frankly less fun than knocking on a new door with the hope that comes from the unknown. If I'm doing a follow up, I know they've already said no once, or they've already blown me off once, or they already were indifferent or indecisive or whatever. I know what I'm walking into, and it's not as fun as, hey, what if this person, this brand new door I knock on, is excited to see me? So we have to have clarity in the language of what the different types of encounters are and interactions, so we can have clarity on are they doing the things that are not fun rather than just doing the things that are fun. So one of the things is there's no shortage of CRMs that will help with tracking sales activities. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on CRMs. There's lots of them. They have really cool features and benefits. Also, for years, I just use a simple Excel spreadsheet. That's pretty old school nowadays. There's way more sophisticated ways and more fun ways to do it now. But my point is, finding the right way to track isn't usually too hard, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. The key, in my opinion, is to know what we want to track, have that right balance of not being too restrictive but not too passive, and also having those regular conversations with the salespeople where we actually go over the actual information that they report to us. So again, going back to my example with Mike, the reason we had that conversation where he fudged his sales report was because we were actually going through, here's what you said you did on that Tuesday or whatever day it was, and it turned out to be not be true, but that's an anomaly. I'm not going to focus on that. But point is, we actually were going through, like, here's the things you said, here's the people you went and saw. What's the next step for this one? Who is this one using? Why, did they said yes? Why did they say yes? If they said no, why did they say no? Those conversations, whether it was a weekly 1 hour meeting or a daily 15-minute check-in, those things have been huge as far as making consistent progress. And I've really felt like we're making good progress with our sales efforts. It was when those meetings were serious, not just light conversations. When I say serious, I don't mean they can't be fun. I just mean that we were going through the details and having meaningful conversation. We went through, what are the things you think are the most, what's the low hanging fruit? What's the most benefit? What are we doing and why, basically, right? With intention and like really getting into it, but not scrutinizing into every, to the degree that, again, it becomes so restrictive. So when I say they're serious, I don't mean they can't be fun. I mean that we're going through the details and having meaningful conversation, not just a light overview and a general, well, how are things going? Like, those kind of conversations are fine here and there, or even over half the time. But somewhere along the way, we have to have more meaningful conversation. At least that's where I felt like I was, like, really feeling like we were making progress in our sales efforts. So in short, they need to do their part with the tracking activities, and I need to do my part in setting the expectations for what good tracking looks like, and regularly having those conversations where we review what is going on in our next steps. So this is a balance of, you have to inspect what you expect, a phrase we've all heard many times before, and leaving enough latitude for them to be excited, to make good decisions, and do all the things in sales that can't be remotely controlled. Where I have failed before is by either being too hands-on or too hands-off. Neither extreme has ever worked well for me. And this is something that, when the phones aren't ringing, I remember getting, like, really dialed in, like, phones aren't ringing, like, we got to get things going right now. Like, bring in your last 2 weeks call reports. We're going to go through every single detail. Well, that's not very fun. And it's not consistent. And there's a whole bunch of reasons why I think that is not a great approach, having done it myself. And also, they just, see the guy, pass your salesperson in the hall and ask her, like, well, hey, how are things going? And she says, great. And meanwhile, things are not going great, and we never know. So neither of those two approaches have worked well for me. It's all about finding the right balance. At least that's what's worked for me. So basically, things we want to figure out is what's a reasonable amount of time to be tracking out of a work week. What specific activities and appropriate next steps should be tracked? How often are we going to meet and review? And making sure I'm holding both of us accountable to do our part. Again, I've got to set the expectation. I have to understand the kinds of things I need to have tracked. Like if they win the lottery, move to the Caribbean, like how would I pick up where they left off? And I've got to hold myself accountable to actually have the meaningful conversations to review what's going on. So a reminder to go to joinbusinesstips.com to get immediate help with launching or rebooting your B2B or business development plan or any other challenge you're facing from someone who's been there. So this wraps up our series on revamping or restarting a B2B business development program. It also wraps up this podcast. This is the 200th episode, which is a milestone I'm really happy to hit. Going into 2025, I'm going to be changing up how I do this kind of content. I know that listening to someone talk about what are not always exciting topics for 15 minutes is a lot to ask. And I'm looking for different formats for the future, and I'll be sure to let you know what's coming, as it unfolds. I'll be sure to let you know like what it's going to look like and when we get going and things like that. For now, I just want to say that I appreciate all the kind comments I've gotten about this podcast over the years, and I sincerely hope this provided information that's been helpful. That's been my number one goal, is to provide information and insights that are helpful, talk about things that I think are people have struggled with and can get benefit from. That's been my number one goal. So I hope it's done that. And so again, I'll let you know as I figure out more clearly what the next steps are going to be as far as content and things like that. And I will let you know when that happens. Until then, I'm wishing you all the very best 2025 and much continued success for your business in the future. And that's all.